And now for our final presentation of the day, we have our gracious host county, Sacramento. Please welcome Chief Lee Seale and his team to discuss multifaceted approaches to alternatives to detention.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I am cognizant of the fact that I've talked a lot today, so I'm going to keep it short. You're going to hear from the people who you really need to hear from, which are the three experts to my left. They've created something very special. Before we get into that, I will really thank Chief Garcia and what they're doing in Sutter County. It's an honor to follow that, and I think we continue to see these themes throughout this conference. Working with families is a best practice that we've heard over and over again throughout all of California, integral part of what we're achieving with juvenile realignment, and you're going to hear that again today. So with that, it's really my privilege to introduce this program. It goes back to about 2010, so it really is part and parcel to the kind of things that we see have developed in the last decade. It is something that we could not have done without resources and support from the state in the form of MHSA funding. I think YOBG funding played a piece in it as well as helping to keep it going and support. So it really is exactly what we're talking about with this conference, where making resources available to locals, we can get the job done. So with that, I'm honored to introduce our panelists today. It really goes to the collaboration that these three go way back and have a really strong history of working together as partners. So with that, I will introduce first all the way to the left, Amy Fierro, who is the Chief Program Officer at River Oak Center for Children, one of our really integral partners here in Sacramento County. They serve our youth in so many kinds of important ways and so many kinds of programs beyond just the one you're going to hear about today. So we really can't say enough about that partnership and what Amy and her whole team do for our county. Then we have Pamela Hassan, who is our senior mental health counselor. She's obviously an important part of, is our behavioral health partner and important part of the team here. Obviously, again, just as what I said with River Oak, our partnership with behavioral health goes beyond just this program. It's throughout the entirety of our juvenile programs and adult programs as well. So it really, we're thankful for that. And then finally, who I will pass it off to, our Assistant Chief of Juvenile Operations, Mike Shores. Mike has been with the department for over 2 decades and really has been a huge force in bringing our department through the kinds of changes that we've talked about throughout this conference, really helping to move our department through some of the kinds of practices that we knew we had to get away from, whether we're talking about serving kids better in the community or serving kids better inside our juvenile hall. Mike has led that fight for our department every step of the way throughout the entirety of his career. So I can't say enough about how thankful I am to him personally for all that he's achieved and all that he has done for our department. In a sense, I think it's fair to say that this program is really speaks to the whole team, but Mike in particular was a big driving force of it as well. So again, my thanks and my honor to introduce to you Mike Shores. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Chief. I really appreciate the introduction, and I think what I'll do to start us off is take us back a little bit in time to talk about the Juvenile Justice Diversion and Treatment Program, or JJDTP, as we refer it to. If we go back to really the early to mid-2000s in Sacramento County, the juvenile detention rates, as we've seen over the last couple of days, have been declining, and in Sacramento County, it really was no exception. We had a facility at that time that was built to serve about built to house about 260 youth. And it wasn't uncommon on any given day that we would have over 400 kids in custody. So during that time, we were under a suitability plan with the Board of Corrections, now the Board of State and Community Corrections. And we're really starting to look at what could we do to start to alleviate some of the pressure on our youth detention facility. Around that same time, as I think most of us did, we started to look at detention risk assessment instruments. We started to look at risk need assessments, and as we implemented both of those tools, we were really able to dig down and take a deep dive and look at who are the kids that we're housing in detention. What we found out at that time is that we had a lot of kids that were low to moderate risk, kids that had extensive and high mental health need, kids that had long histories of trauma and abuse, and a lot of kids that were still involved in the child welfare system. We would look at the criminality of these kids, and these kids were typically very low-level offenders, but they were staying in detention for an extremely long period of time. If we were successful at finding placement or getting them back home, the lack of really appropriate treatment in the community resulted in either AWOLs from group home care or violations from home, and we would start the revolving door of detention all over again. The other challenge with this population is that once these youth came into detention, they didn't do well. The underlying mental health issues that they brought with them into the facility were exacerbated by the detention experience. We would see these kids act out. The acting out would result in a restraint. The restraint would result in the use of isolation. The use of isolation would result in more acting out, and thus the cycle of restraint and isolation would really begin. In about 2009, our behavioral health director at the time allocated some funding from the Mental Health Services Act for a juvenile justice program. There was a handful of people that were really actively involved in planning. There was a lot of committees that went on. But in 2010, we were successful in grabbing onto that funding and creating the Juvenile Justice Diversion and Treatment Program. And after the contract was awarded to our partners, River Oaks Center for Children, services were delivered starting in late 2010. I think Amy's going to talk quite a bit more about that as we get into the presentation. There we go. The model of the program, when we created it back at that time, it was really designed to serve at-risk as well as juvenile justice youth, ages 13 to 26. The really good thing about this program is that these kids could stay in treatment up until their 26th birthday, as long as the treatment need existed and the youth wanted to participate. So even if they successfully got off of probation, even if they turned 18, they could stay in treatment as long as they desired and if the treatment need existed. The program originally was designed to have the capacity of 96 youth. In the last year, we've added 36 additional slots for a total of 128. We have the ability to refer youth at a variety of points in the sort of entry into the juvenile justice system. We can refer youth pre-filing, so before we've moved a petition over to the district attorney's office, we can divert the youth out and make the referral to the JJ program. We can refer post-filing or predispositionally, where we can hope to maybe sort of detour the youth into the juvenile justice system, and we can make referrals post-dispositionally so that the youth, while under juvenile supervision, can receive these services. The funding that supports this collaboration pays for 2 probation officers, which was pretty unique in the Mental Health Services Act arena, which typically doesn't like to fund law enforcement positions. The funding also supports the senior mental health clinician and the contracts that the treatment provider operates under. Last, the full service partnership is another unique aspect of this program. The treatment provider has the ability to serve not just the youth, but the entire family. They can serve the parents, the siblings, anyone else who may have an underlying treatment need that's going to help with the rehabilitation of the youth that they're serving. We developed 5 primary goals when we developed the program. Those are to reduce out-of-home placements and homelessness. Kids that come into the juvenile justice system with these underlying issues oftentimes end up in out-of-home placements. We saw that the kids that were in detention that would cycle through restraint and isolation also would cycle through placements where they would run away, they would come back into detention. Every single time they'd come back to detention, they would stay longer and longer. And ultimately, many of these kids would end up out of state, or they would end up at DJJ. This was prior to SB 81, and so these youth, just due to their behavior, would end up at then California Youth Authority. The second goal was to increase school attendance and achievement. One of the major, I think, initiatives that we've taken on here in Sacramento County is to really ensure that education is a foundation for all the work that we do on the juvenile side of our work, whether it's in detention, in our community supervision division, or even in placement. We're engaging education, we're embedding officers into the districts, and we're trying to take advantage of services that are available to youth through the educational system. Our officers' first and foremost responsibility on a day in, day out basis is to ensure that kids are getting to school. And if they're not in school, that will then start to drive and allow us to target our home visitation so we can find out what the reasons are for the truancy issues. This program really helps us achieve that goal as well. The third goal was to increase vocational training and employment. As these youth start to age, become adults, and if they continue to receive treatment into their 26, or young adolescent years, we really needed to make sure that these types of services were available as well. I think this is an area that we're really continuing to evolve. We have, I think, an area of real improvements that we can make there. It's a tough area with this population of kid. The fourth goal was to reduce psychiatric hospitalizations. These kids have very acute mental health need, and frequently we're in and out of our local psychiatric hospitals. So reducing that and creating a stable environment that was in a community setting was really critical to the success of this program. And last, the reduction of juveniles in detention, or the reduction, as well as the reduction of those kids going into the adult criminal justice system are goals of ours. I talked a bit about juvenile detention and the cycle of time spent there. As we wrap up today, I'll talk a little bit about some of the data that shows what those detention rates have been, but that's been a big goal of this program as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Pam, and she'll talk a little bit about referrals and the supervision model.
Okay, and you'll give me my slide.
I think I got it.
So I am the behavioral health side. Our county has decided to run this program together with the behavioral health department and the probation department. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, which is important because this program actually requires a mental health diagnosis and a severely emotionally disabled component in order to have eligibility to participate. So I have a couple of important roles in this program. At the front end, I am the one who meets with youth and evaluate them for the program, and that's not just them, but it is their family. So I've met each and every child that is coming into the program. I talk to them about the mental health issues that they've been experiencing. I talk to the parents about how they are working with their child's mental health issues. And really, I provide quite a bit of psychoeducation in that process. You'd be amazed how many kids have been experiencing mental health issues for many years by the time we touch them, and yet how many families tell me they've never ever had those explained to them before. So it's really an important part of the process, partly to inform them about what's going on with their brains and their behaviors, and partly to set them up for the services that our service provider is going to be providing. So I try to get them really engaged in that process right from the get-go. These meetings take place in the community. This whole program takes place in the community. So I might be meeting them in juvenile hall. I might be meeting them at a psychiatric hospital, in their home, at their school. It just really depends on what works for that family. This program is a voluntary program, and that is important. Even kids with court orders have choice about how they meet those orders. We are looking for youth and families who really do want to make changes in the path that this child is on. It's a very important piece. We have a lot of services available. Amy's going to talk about those in some depth. And that's part of the evaluation process, is talking to them about what is involved. It's a pretty intensive program. There are a lot of providers involved. That's not for everybody. So I explain how that's going to look to them and make sure that they're up for that level of intervention. Once they're in, once we deem them eligible and they have accepted services, I do a bunch of paperwork to get them authorized, and I send the referral over to River Oak, and I kind of loosely monitor their progress in the program, just to make sure they're getting the services, all that is happening, but also that part helps me to know what to talk to other families about in the future. If I'm looking at how kids are doing in the program, it helps me when I'm evaluating future youth for participation in the program. And then can you go ahead and give me the next slide? So the other really important role for me here, as far as the behavioral health and probation collaboration, is that I'm located right in the probation unit. So I'm a behavioral health employee, I'm located in the probation unit. And it is an intensive supervision unit, not as intensive as the one that we just heard about before this, but we do have lower caseloads in this unit, and the officers do see the kids on a very frequent basis, and in various settings, home, school. They attend MDT meetings with us. And it's a different kind of probation supervision than some of them have been accustomed to doing before. And I have to say that, especially listening to the things that are being said here today, I feel very privileged to be part of this change to focus on mental health that this program is working with. So I have the pleasure of getting to talk to probation officers about understanding the mental health issues of their youth. They're not psychology majors. I will talk to them about different disorders, how those affect behavior, how those look in terms of behavior. Excuse me. And we start off in the beginning. I've written a summary of the case, and they start off by kind of taking a look at that and learning what the issues are. And then we'll sometimes talk about things like how to approach this child, how to approach this family, what kind of things you might be walking into and seeing there. And I talked to them about using the treatment team. For example, they get a call from a parent or a school saying, this young person just destroyed a classroom or punched a hole in my wall. And maybe in times past that would have resulted in a reprimand or a sanction of some sort. We'll call on the team to perhaps go out there and do some intensive work on maybe how the youth manages their anger, or another good example is kids who are avoidant of school. School is so important to all of us in this whole project. So that kid might have an anxiety disorder or a depressive disorder. So I work with the probation officers to talk to them about why that looks that way and why that youth might be avoiding school. And this is another area where we might want to have the probation officer reach out to the team in terms of working with the youth on that mental health issue or on that skill before we give them a sanction or a violation. So our probation officers are really working on the creative solutioning, and that is something that I kind of feel privileged to get to work on with them. And it's really kind of neat. The probation officers sit in on the weekly meetings at River Oak. We have a multidisciplinary team meeting every Wednesday. So a discussion goes around about what's going on with kids and what the team can do and what the probation officers can do. There's a lot of collaboration there. And then I get to sit in the office and hear things like phone calls and conference calls and kids that you can hear screaming all the way across there, even though it's the probation officer's cell phone. But I get to see the officers implementing some of the things that they have heard about in the team meetings. Just recently, one of our probation officers was being screamed at by one of her young wards. And, you know, rather than say, hey, Missy, settle down, you don't talk to me that way, she really employed some great calming techniques, got that kid to come back down to a level where they could communicate and they could talk about what's acceptable and not acceptable and what that young person needed to do. So another thing I wanted to say that has been really beneficial to the POs in using mental health as a focus with interacting with their kids is the designing of sanctions. They have various options available to them. So educating them about what mental health issues are helps them to figure out what makes sense for this kid. So you don't want to take a kid who has terrible impulse control and terrible anger issues and is agitated and then stick them in a house arrest type of situation, but yet you need to hold them accountable for their behavior so we can all get together and figure out, depending on what the issues those kids and families are dealing with, what kind of accountability that they can also be held to. So that's kind of my role. I've got the front-end evaluation, I've got the working with the officers on implementing the mental health focus. And then what else do I want to make sure I focus on? I just wanted to emphasize again, and Mike did mention it, but the component of our program that allows youth to stay for as long as they need to, typically we target age 13 to 17 to come in to the program, but once they are up and running, they can stay in, and sometimes they've actually discharged and come back later when they're more ready to work on things, or they want to continue their progress. But that component really helps with this solidifying of some of the skills that they've learned and some of the interventions that they've learned. And so that's one of the nicest things about the program. And I think I'll pass it on to Amy to talk about all the wonderful work that they are doing.
Cue video.
Oh, cue video. Oh, I'm so sorry.
I think it's a nice
We have a
segue.
short video
We're
from
going
our
to show a
probation
brief video
officers.
of the officer's perspective of this work. So if we can roll that up.
I have this female on my caseload who is a juvenile. She's 16, and prior to being on my caseload, she was known to be very obnoxious, rude. She would cuss people out. We reached out to her and her social worker, and we were able to pull together as a team. And even with her on board, and mind you, it's unconventional family. It's not the normal family that she came from. So we reached out to her stepbrother, who she's very close with, and all of us together were able to change her situation for the better for her.
So I have a minor on my caseload now that, had it been in the past, most likely would have been violated or arrested. But nowadays, working with the JJDTP program, we work with the family, the grandmother, his brothers actually, and his sisters, and the River Oaks Center for Children.
So River Oaks provides multiple services for our youth. These are services that 10 years ago, maybe even almost 5 years ago, we probably wouldn't have had.
When a juvenile girl who's 16 tells you, hey, you've made a difference in my life, that's something to be proud of, and I'm very proud of that.
You know, you run into a kid, or actually he's a man now, you know, he's 27, 28, he was 15 years old when I first started with our program, and now you have, hey, I'm doing great, I have a job, I have multiple kids, I got my wife, I completed my education, I'm out doing big things, I'm a union worker at this point in time, so I'm providing for my family and not out there committing crimes like I used to.
So that is a representation of the great partners we work with. Thank you to Sacramento County Probation. It is a privilege for me to be here, and it's a privilege for me to be in charge of a program that has done so much wonderful work in Sacramento and works with a very special population. So I'm very happy to be here. Juvenile Justice Diversion and Treatment Program, we started December 2010, and we've served since then about 560 youth. Every youth that's referred by Pam or whoever has come through probation come to us, and we, right off the bat, introduce them to the intake worker, a youth advocate, a family advocate. The youth advocate and family advocate both have lived experience in the juvenile justice world. So the hiring we do for youth advocates, we make sure that they can successfully match and mentor and know what that person's been through. So we try to introduce them from the beginning. Also, family advocacy is meant for, we hire parents who've helped their children navigate the systems of probation as well as sometimes child welfare. So each plan and each youth has an individually tailored plan. So when we use the transition to independence process, sometimes people call that TIP. So we use that, it's very individualized. Every youth's plan is gonna look very, very different. We use an intensive model. We have many different staff. We have clinicians. We have skills trainers. I already mentioned the youth and family advocates. We also have a housing and benefits specialist, because we know and realize that a lot of what happens in this program and these youth that are developing into young adults need to, first of all, learn about education, vocational training, and then move on and get their own housing. So, and the MHSA funding part of this program is what helps us to do that, and I can talk a little bit further about that. We talked earlier about buzzwords or jargon, but I'm going to say a few right now. So we have evidence-based practices in behavioral health. These are really, really well-known practices, as well as, I believe, most of you guys would know about functional family therapy and multi-systemic therapy, because they're really some of the best models for juvenile justice and their families, juvenile justice referred youth. So these are the programs that we have, and we refer them as necessary, and obviously this helps the youth meet their goals to get off probation. The funding for additional supports is can be for housing, it can be to buy that laptop that they need to be successful in school. It could be to help them with clothing, or clothing to do interviews, or sometimes in some circumstances to pay for rent, to help families who are getting evicted or have lost electricity. We have very quick accounting teams, so we always find ourselves a big team at River Oak. So if a family needs something at 4 o'clock in the afternoon on a Friday, which is going to be today, I can assure you that my accounting team will make sure that that family gets what they need. So I'm going to focus just a few slides on some of our outcomes. So the first slide has to do with basically what we look at overall when someone has discharged the program. So over the entire inception of the program, every youth that is discharged, the average was 42% of those youth achieved their treatment goals, and those treatment goals would be their behavioral health treatment goals. And 54% at the time of discharge were living with a parent. Some of those more recent fiscal years, so last fiscal year and the year before, those numbers are more into the 58, 54%, but this is overall since inception. Going on to the program outcomes, these are related to our CAN score, so another jargon, right? You guys probably have heard of CANS, potentially that's the Child and Adolescent Needs and Strengths Assessment. This is an assessment that you use, clinicians and families actually make the scores together, so it's a communication tool, but it also helps us know what needs the family has, and then we do this in the beginning, every 6 months, and at discharge. So with this CAN scores, we saw a 57% reduction in delinquency, 53% in improved school achievement, and 65% improved school behavior. In terms of the next slide, this is talking about our youth outcome questionnaire. So this is more related to their kind of interpsychic or things going on in their behavioral health symptoms. So the youth does their own scoring and the parent does the scoring for the youth, what's going on in their world in terms of their behavioral health. So from intake to discharge, family reported a 23% reduction in overall distress over that period of time. And this youth reported 16% reduction. The thing I find interesting about this is coming into treatment, the parents often say that the distress is much higher than the youth do. So the youth, 16%, although it looks less, when they're reporting their distress at intake, they're actually below the clinical cutoff for having a diagnosable mental illness. So that's pretty neat to see. And then the last slide is about program satisfaction. So as we talked about, we are a contractor with Sacramento County Behavioral Health Services, and we do satisfaction questionnaires every 6 months. And so the most recent satisfaction survey, when we asked families about overall satisfaction, they ranked it as 91%, and the youth ranked this as 82%. And I think that speaks volumes in a lot of different ways. This program satisfaction isn't at discharge, and it could be at intake, it could be when you're in mid-treatment. So overall, families have been pretty satisfied, and it's always fun to see that some of the youth may not be excited about it at first, but over time they have been pretty satisfied. I'm going to end with two quotes. Every quarter, we have an advisory dinner, and we invite all of the youth and their families to a dinner where our advocates meet with them and our program managers, and we talk about what can we do better, what do you like about the program, and we've been doing this since the inception of the program. And I just pulled out two quotes from that. So youth stated, "I like how the program has helped me achieve goals that I have set for myself to further in life and eventually get myself out of the juvenile justice system." And a parent states, "I like that everyone is knowledgeable with their duties and job. I recommend this program to any parent like me. You guys change lives."
Thanks, Amy. Okay, we're a little bit over. I'm going to run through, just to wrap up, a couple quick data points, and these are going to be more specific to probation. I mentioned our overcrowding issue that we had in the early 2000s. Today, we have a juvenile detention facility that will house 444 youth, and as of this morning, we had 125 kids in custody. So that population has gone way down, and we're no longer under a suitability plan. Haven't been for a long time, but I think that's a very positive number, and it really reflects well, I think, on this program. We've reduced our use of force in custody by over 80%. We rarely have to use room confinement, and we've reduced time in rooms by over 90%. The number of youth that we have in placement was at one point over 400. Today we have 89 kids that are in out-of-home placement, and that includes both in-state and out-of-state facilities. And the last number is that in the total number of youth under court jurisdiction in Sacramento County was at one point over 6,000 kids, and today we have just over 2,000. So it's programs like this, I think, that are really showing results, and those are the results that we're all, I think, looking for. So thank you for giving us the time to present to you today.